This meeting will come to order. We're going to ask the press to please clear. This hearing of the Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, will commence our hearing. Today we have a hearing titled The Role of BP in the Deepwater Horizon Explosion and Oil Spill. We have a number of members present for this hearing who are not members of the subcommittee, but are members of the full Energy and Commerce Committee. I welcome them, and I note that they will be allowed to submit written statements for the record, but will not deliver verbal opening statements. In addition, after all subcommittee members complete their questioning, full committee members will be allowed to ask questions. Members who are not on the subcommittee or on the Energy and Commerce Committee are welcome to observe, but they will not be permitted to provide opening statements or ask questions due to time constraints. The chairman, ranking member, and chairman emeritus will be recognized for 5-minute opening statements. Other members of the committee will be recognized for 3-minute opening statements. I will yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for the first opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing. And Mr. Hayward, thank you for being here today. Yesterday, BP pledged to establish a $20 billion escrow account and to suspend its dividend payments for the rest of the year. I'm sure these were not easy decisions for you, but they were the right ones, and I commend you for them. Congress has multiple committees examining the Gulf oil spill. Some are evaluating the impact of the spill. Some are working on the reorganization of the regulatory agencies. And some, including Chairman Markey's subcommittee, are drafting legislation to reform our oil exploration laws. You are testifying today before the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, and this subcommittee has a special role to examine the facts and determine what went wrong and to make recommendations to prevent future spills. When it's time for questioning, I and other members of the subcommittee will ask you about a series of internal BP documents. They appear to show that BP repeatedly took shortcuts that endangered lives and increased the risks of a catastrophic blowout. And I sent you a letter in advance indicating that we're going to question you about those issues. But what is equally important is what is missing from the documents. When you became CEO of BP, you promised to focus like a laser on safe and reliable operations. We wanted to know what you had done to keep this promise. So we asked what emails you had received, what documents you had reviewed about the Deepwater Horizon rig or the Macondo well before the blowout. Deepwater drilling is inherently dangerous. As the entire country now knows, an uncontrolled blowout can kill rig workers and cause an environmental disaster. We wanted to know whether you were briefed about the risks and were monitoring the safety of the drilling operation. We could find no evidence that you paid any attention to the tremendous risks BP was taking. We've reviewed 30,000 pages of documents from BP, including your emails. There is not a single email or document that shows you paid even the slightest attention to the dangers at this well. You are the CEO, so we considered the possibility that you may have delegated the oversight responsibility to someone else. We reviewed the emails and briefing documents received by Andy Inglis, the Chief Executive for Exploration and Production, and Doug Suttles, the Chief Operating Officer for Exploration and Production, and the person now leading BP's response to the spill. According to BP, these are the senior officials who were responsible for the Macondo well, but they too were apparently oblivious to what was happening. We could find no evidence that either of them received any emails or briefings about the Deepwater Horizon rig or drilling activities at the well. BP's corporate complacency is astonishing. The drilling engineer for the rig called Macondo a nightmare well. Other BP employees predicted that the cement job would fail. Halliburton warned of a severe gas flow problem. These warnings fell on deaf ears. BP's corporate attitude may best be summed up in an email from its operations drilling engineer who oversaw BP's team of drilling engineers. After learning of the risks and BP's decision to ignore them, he wrote, quote, "Who cares? It's done. End of story. We'll probably be fine," end quote. There is a complete contradiction between BP's words and deeds. You were brought in to make safety the top priority of BP. But under your leadership, BP has taken the most extreme risks. BP cut corner after corner to save $1 million here, a few hours or days there, and now the whole Gulf Coast is paying the price. Today's hearing will focus on BP's actions, but we learned from our hearing earlier this week that the other oil companies are just as unprepared to deal with a massive spill as BP. We are seeing in the oil industry the same corporate indifference to risk that caused the collapse on Wall Street. And that is why reform is so urgently needed. Part of this reform must be legislation to put teeth into our regulatory system, but part must also be a transition to a clean energy economy. We're addicted to oil. This addiction is fouling our beaches, polluting our atmosphere, and undermining our national security. We can't snap our fingers or transform our energy economy overnight, but we need to start down a path to a clean energy future. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to today's hearing, and Mr. Hayward, I thank you for appearing and cooperating with our investigation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next, go to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton of Texas. Mr. Burgess and I will do our openings after the chair and the ranker. Mr. Barton, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hayward, for appearing before us. We have kind of a dual track underway, in my opinion. We obviously are trying to gather the facts, what happened in the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a month and a half ago, trying to find out the causes of that spill, what can be done to prevent it in the future. We're obviously very concerned about the mitigation and the cleanup. We have a system in America built up based on the British tradition over 200 years of due process and fairness, where people that do bad things, or in this case a corporation that is responsible for a bad accident, we want to hold them responsible, do what we can to make the liable parties pay for the damages. Mr. Stupak and Mr. Waxman are doing an excellent job working with Dr. Burgess and myself in conducting, I think, a very fair oversight investigation. And we're going to get into a number of those issues in this hearing, and we're going to ask you some pretty tough questions. I'm speaking now totally for myself. I'm not speaking for the Republican Party. I'm not speaking for anybody in the House of Representatives but myself. But I'm ashamed of what happened in the White House yesterday. I think it is a tragedy of the first proportion that a private corporation can be subjected to what I would characterize as a shakedown. in this case a $20 billion shakedown, with the Attorney General of the United States, who is legitimately conducting a criminal investigation and has every right to do so to protect the interests of the American people, participating in what amounts to a $20 billion slush fund that's unprecedented in our nation's history, that's got no legal standing, and which sets, I think, a terrible precedent for the future. If I called you into my office and I had the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Stupak, with me, who was legitimately conducting an oversight investigation on your company, and said, if you put so many millions of dollars in a project in my congressional district, I could go to jail and should go to jail. Now, there is no question that British Petroleum owns this lease. There is no question that BP, I'm sorry, it's not British Petroleum anymore, that BP made decisions that objective people think compromise safety. There is no question that BP is liable for the damages. But we have a due process system where we go through hearings, in some cases court cases, litigation, and determine what those damages are and when those damages should be paid. So I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for anybody else, but I apologize. I do not want to live in a country where any time a citizen or a corporation does something that is legitimately wrong, is subject to some sort of political pressure that is, again, in my words, amounts to a shakedown. So I apologize. But on this hearing today, I am with Mr. Waxman, with Mr. Stupak. There are answers that need to be asked, questions that need to be asked that are legitimate, because we don't want another oil spill of this magnitude or of any magnitude in the Gulf of Mexico. And if this subcommittee can do things that make it much more difficult for this type of an incident to occur in the future, then we will have done our work for the American people. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. I'm going to do my opening statement now. Today is the 59th day of the BP oil spill that has devastated much of the Gulf of Mexico. 11 men lost their lives the day the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig exploded, and in the 59 days that have followed, countless people have lost their livelihood as the oil spill closes fishing grounds and pollutes the shores of the 3 states. This is the 3rd hearing of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee has held, and the 5th hearing overall in the Energy and Commerce Committee. Our first hearing exposed problems discovered with the blowout preventer and several other factors that contributed to the disaster. Our second hearing was a field hearing that contributed to the disaster. Our second hearing was a field hearing in New Orleans, where we heard from the widows of 2 men who died in the Deepwater Horizon explosion, as well as shrimpers and other small business owners who have suffered from the environmental catastrophe that followed. Our staff has spent weeks combing through hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, sitting through more than 50 hours of briefings by corporate, governmental, and academic experts in an attempt to piece together what went wrong with BP exploration of the Macondo well. We have reviewed several questionable decisions made by BP in the days and hours leading up to the explosion, and what we have learned so far is alarming. We've learned that time after time, BP had warning signs that this was, as one employee put it, a nightmare well. BP made choices that set safety aside in exchange for cost-cutting and time-saving decisions. For example, BP disregarded questionable results from pressure tests after cementing in the well. BP selected the riskier of 2 options for their well design. They could have hung a liner from the lower end of the casing already in the well and install a tieback on the top of the liner, which would have provided additional barriers to the release of hydrocarbons. Instead, they lowered a full string of the new casing, which took less time and cost less, but did not provide the same protection against escaping hydrocarbons. BP was warned by their cement contractor, Halliburton, that the well could have a severe gas flow problem if BP lowered the final string of casing with only 6 centralizers instead of the 21 Halliburton recommended. BP rejected Halliburton's advice to use additional centralizers in an email on April 16th. A BP official involved in the decision explained, and I quote, "It will take 10 hours to install them. I don't like this," end of quote. BP chose not to fully circulate the mud in the well from the bottom to the top, which was an industry-recommended best practice that would have allowed them to test for gas in the mud. BP chose not to use a casing hanger lockdown sleeve, which would have provided extra protection against a blowout from below. These are just a few of the issues that led to the disaster. Once Deepwater Horizon exploded and sank to the bottom of the sea, BP's response to contain the leak and clean up the spilled oil was equally as poor. They issued lowball estimates of the amount of oil flowing from the well, which may have led to a scaled-back response. We discovered that BP's oil spill response plan was virtually identical to other oil companies' plans. In a hearing Tuesday, ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson admitted that once the spills occur, he says, quote, "We are not well equipped to handle them," end of quote. All the other oil companies testified at Tuesday's hearing that they would not have drilled the well as BP did. Our witness today, Mr. Tony Hayward, is the Chief Executive Officer of BP. Shortly after Mr. Hayward took over as the CEO in 2007, he held a town hall meeting with employees in Houston. At this meeting, he discussed the need for BP to be a leaner, with fewer people in decision-making process. This article, and I'll ask you to put up the Guardian article, an article from September 27, 2007, Guardian newspaper in London, titled, "Hayward Says Oil Company Has Become Too Cautious," reads, and I quote, "Assurance is killing us," Mr. Hayward told U.S. staff, noting that too many people were engaged in decision-making, leading to excessive cautiousness, something that critics of its safety performance in the U.S. might question. Let me put up these other notes from the same meeting. We received notes from BP of employees and their note-taking from this meeting. The employee notes summarize Mr. Hayward's statements as follows. "I don't think having all these layers of assurance reduce risk, and it can actually increase it. The best way to reduce risk is to have deep technical competence where we need it. Individuals need to be accountable for risk and to manage it." End of quote. I find this cavalier attitude towards risk, assessing risk, unbelievable, given the fact that at the time of these statements, BP had just been responsible for the largest oil leak in Alaska history on the North Slope, as well as the 2005 Texas City refinery explosion, which killed 15 workers and injured another 170. I must ask Mr. Hayward whether it was wise to adopt this leaner decision-making process with input from fewer people and a new approach to managing risk. Under the leadership of Bob Malone, the former chairman and president of BP America, BP created an independent office of the Ombudsman headed by Judge Stanley Sporkin. The Ombudsman office was established because line workers reported fearing retaliation if they reported safety concerns to management. When the current chairman and president, Lamar McKay, took over, I met with him and he suggested that he hoped to improve the culture enough to make the Ombudsman office unnecessary so he could shut it down. I urged him not to eliminate the office because it serves a significant role in investigating employee complaints. I'm more concerned now than ever about BP's safety and the role they take in assuming risk. I'm concerned that the corporate culture, from BP CEO Tony Hayward down to Chairman and President of BP America, Lamar McKay, and Chief Operating Officer Doug Suttle, that there's a willingness to cut costs and take greater risk. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Hayward answer the many hard-hitting questions from our committee members we'll ask today. I hope we will hear honest, contrite, and substantive answers. Mr. Hayward, you owe it to all Americans. We are not small people, but we wish to get our lives back. For the Americans who live and work on the Gulf Coast, it may be years before they get their lives back. For the Americans who lost their lives on the rigs, their families may never get their lives back. Mr. Hayward, I'm sure you will get your life back, and with a golden parachute back to England. But we in America are left with the terrible consequences of BP's reckless disregard for safety. I yield back my time and turn to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Stupak. Today it does open our third hearing, and a very critical hearing, into this subcommittee's ongoing investigation into the tragic accident of the Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill, which continues 24 hours a day to wreak economic and environmental havoc on our Gulf Coast. This hearing provides the subcommittee with an important opportunity to directly question the man who ultimately leads BP, Mr. Tony Hayward, the company's chief executive officer. And BP's role has been central to the causes of the incident and to the response. Over the course of our inquiry to date, committee investigators working in a bipartisan fashion have conducted numerous interviews and briefings and reviewed tens of thousands of pages of documents. Our subcommittee staff has done an excellent job, and this subcommittee has been focused on gathering the facts rather than rushing to judgment. And from this intensive effort, we've begun to identify a number of serious questions about BP's decision-making that led up to the disaster. Exploring these and related questions today will help us identify for Congress and identify for the country what went wrong on April 20th and the days thereafter. And while we are investigating, a picture of the chain of events leading to this incident is emerging. Mr. Chairman, you and Chairman Waxman recently outlined some critical questions that we hope Mr. Hayward will address. For example, you noted the investigation has identified questionable choices by BP engineers to use a particular well design over another one that would appear to have provided more built-in barriers to an uncontrolled gas discharge. There was the choice made by BP to move forward with what appears to be an inadequate cementing plan and the related failure, despite clear warnings, to test that the cement was properly set and in place. And it appears there may have been a rush to move off this well. Whether there may have been economic or other time or performance pressures, some combination thereof, it is not clear, but that clarity needs to emerge today. The questions arising from our investigation outline the central role in BP's decision-making appears to have had in this incident. We need to understand that decision-making, Mr. Hayward. What factors influenced it, whether the decisions reflected a management and an operational mindset that failed to maximize safety in a challenging deep-sea environment. It is important to note that the picture developing from this investigation is not one of technological limits in deep-sea drilling. The construction of an 18,000-foot well was not pushing the envelope of engineering know-how so far as we have identified, but the picture developing is one of unsafe industry practices, although clearer, more focused industry standards may be in order going forward. Available evidence suggests that the use of best industry practices would have resulted in more cautious designs and more testing, more safeguards, and ultimately no loss of control of the well. Rather, and quite clearly, the picture developing from our investigation is one of questionable decision-making by people charged with designing and successfully drilling, constructing, and controlling a well that was a mile underwater. It is a picture composed of a series of choices which, taken together, created an oil well particularly vulnerable to a blowout, and of all the people who may have been distracted, unaware, or resistant to recognizing the problems around them. Documents show that BP was prepared to run a test on the quality of the cement job, but chose not to. I can't understand why, given the history of this particular well with 4 previous well control incidents in the 2 months prior to April 20th. The rig personnel appear to have taken their eye off the ball. BP employees were the key decision makers. Certainly others, contractors, subcontractors, certainly federal regulators may have contributed to this incident. The role of the federal government especially, including the overall effectiveness of the response and the efforts to help those harmed by the incident, remains a critical piece that, Mr. Chairman, we must pursue at the level of this committee, and I'm still disappointed that we have not done that. But it is BP's decision-making about the well design, the cementing program, the preparation, the integrity tests, or the lack thereof, or just the general lack of curiosity as to why these would be necessary, the failure to follow best practices that our investigation to date is showing were critical factors in this incident. But this decision-making is difficult to square with the avowed priorities of BP's chief executive. Mr. Hayward, in an interview before you became chief executive, you described how the death of a worker in an operation that you were leading in Venezuela shaped your opinions. You said, and I'm quoting, "I went to the funeral to pay my respects. At the end of the service, his mother came up to me and beat me on the chest. 'Why did you let it happen?' she asked. 'It changed the way I think about safety. Leaders must make safety of all who work for them a priority.'" End quote. Mr. Hayward, I respectfully request that you answer this question in your opening statement. If not for me, then for the two ladies who testified before our committee on the field hearing who lost their husbands on the Deepwater Horizon. You've been chief executive since 2007. You said safety is your number one priority, and you would focus like a laser beam on safety. As chief executive, one would expect your directives and priorities would be carried out by your employees. We have now learned from this investigation that BP employees made 5 critical decisions that may have contributed to well failure where safety was traded off. In fact, it was not the priority. So today, will you assert before this subcommittee that all decisions by BP employees related to the Deepwater Horizon reflected your priority of safety first? Mr. Chairman, the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico shows the consequence of a series of unchecked bad decisions. We in Congress and the federal government must also be mindful of the consequences of bad decision-making. At a field hearing last week in Chalmette, Louisiana, the subcommittee heard some of the administration's decisions are threatening the livelihoods of workers and families who depend upon the energy industry. We've killed half of their fishing with the Deepwater Horizon spill, and it looks like we're going to kill the other half of their economy with our moratorium. Our hearing today looks at the consequences of bad decisions and the lessons learned. May we have the wisdom and humility to take some of those lessons and apply them to ourselves. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. I'd next like to turn to Chairman of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee and Chairman of the Select Committee on Climate. Mr. Markey, 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I want to begin by disagreeing in the strongest possible terms with what Mr. Barton said in his opening statement. Not only is the compensation fund that was created yesterday at the White House in an agreement reached between BP and President Obama not a slush fund and not a shakedown. Rather, it was the government of the United States working to protect the most vulnerable citizens that we have in our country right now, the residents of the Gulf. It is BP's spill, but it is America's ocean, and it is American citizens who are being harmed. We cannot wait, as unfortunately so many citizens who were victims of the Exxon Valdez spill had to wait years in order to see those families compensated. We can't lose sight of the fact that the 1984 Bhopal disaster and the lawsuits that were related to it were only settled last week. We have to ensure that the citizens of the Gulf are protected. In a hearing which this subcommittee conducted in New Orleans last Monday, we heard from a fisherman who brought absolutely impeccable records which proved that he and his family had made $27,000 last May. And after examining the documents, BP gave the family $5,000. The families in the Gulf will be crushed financially unless this compensation fund is put into place. As each day and week and month goes by, the history of these families are going to be altered and permanently altered unless they are given the financial capacity to take care of their loved ones, their children, their families. That's why this compensation fund is so important. That's why it is not a slush fund. That is why it is not a shakedown. It is, in fact, President Obama ensuring that a company which has despoiled the waters of our nation is made accountable for the harm which is done to our people. A company which said for the first week that it was only 1,000 barrels of oil per day, when we now know that they knew it was at least 1,000 to 14,000 barrels. A company which continues to deny that there are underwater toxic plumes. A company which has not been providing the proper protective gear for the workers in the Gulf. A company which contended it could respond to a spill of 250,000 barrels per day. No, this is not a shakedown of the company. This is the American government, President Obama, ensuring that this company is made accountable and sending a signal to all other companies that seek to treat ordinary American families in a way that can destroy their entire family's history. This is, in my opinion, the American government working at its best. This is creating truly the kind of partnership between the public and private sector that can make sure that innocent victims are not roadkill as a result of corporate plans that did not actually factor in the harm that can occur to ordinary families. So I just could not disagree more strongly. I think that this is, in my opinion, one of the most important hearings that this Congress will ever have, because it is sending a signal to any corporations out there, including the ones that testified on Tuesday that all admitted that they had no plans either to respond to the harm which could be done in the Gulf if one of their rigs had the same kind of catastrophic event, that they will be made accountable. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I thank you, Mr. Hayward, because yesterday was the day where the page began to be turned, and we moved to a new era where, in fact, your company is made accountable and the citizens of the Gulf are made whole. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. I next turn to Mr. Sullivan for an opening statement. 3 minutes, please, sir.
Chairman Stupak, thank you for holding this hearing today. On April 20th, 2010, a fire and explosion occurred on the British Petroleum Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. This terrible disaster resulted in the loss of 11 lives and injured many more members of the 126-person crew. There is no question that the BP oil spill is a tragedy. In fact, it is the worst environmental disaster in our nation's history. I believe we must do everything in our power to cap the leak, find out what caused the explosion, and ensure nothing like this ever happens again. BP must bear the entire financial burden for this disaster, and the American taxpayer should not be on the hook for a dime. According to the Occupational Safety Health Administration, there is mounting evidence that BP has one of the worst safety records of any major oil company operating in the United States. To this end, I'm looking forward to examining with Mr. Hayward whether there is a deficient safety culture at BP that led to this disaster and other recent ones, including the BP refinery explosion in 2005 in Texas City, Texas, and a BP pipeline spill in 2007, which released 200,000 gallons of oil into the Alaskan wilderness. Mr. Hayward, why is BP's record on safety so spotty? What is equally as important as our efforts to combat the spill is the knee-jerk legislative reaction from this Congress. Right now, the administration and their allies in the House are more focused on the politics of putting the oil and gas industry out of business than on solutions to the problem. Instead of working in a bipartisan way to push for rigorous safety standards on all offshore rigs, the administration is exploiting this disaster to advance this disastrous cap-and-trade energy policy, which won't stop the well from leaking, but rather will only serve as a national energy tax on the American people, crippling our economy and making the unemployment lines longer. I believe Congress should work towards implementing rigorous safety inspection standards for all offshore rigs, but with nearly 30% of our nation's oil and 11% of our gas reserves located offshore, a ban on offshore drilling will only put Americans out of work, but it will send energy and gas prices through the roof and increase our reliance on foreign imported oil. We still have work to do to uncover exactly what went wrong, and many questions remain on the ongoing efforts to contain the leak. This tragedy should not be used as an excuse to roll back the gains we have made in finding new ways to develop our energy resources, as we will need more oil and natural gas to meet the crucial needs of our nation. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.